You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, the calorie-free alternative to Friends. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
This time we have been watching The First Duty. It first aired the week of 30th of March 1992. It was written by Ronald D. Moore and Naren Shankar and directed by Paul Lynch. James, what happens in this one?
The Enterprise heads to Earth so Picard can deliver the commencement address to Starfleet Academy. But before they arrive, they receive news that Wesley has been involved in an accident during flight training, which means we get to have one of those trial episodes Star Trek does so well. While Wesley is injured, his friend Joshua Albert is killed. During the enquiry, the visual evidence doesn't stack up against Nova Squadron's testimony, with their leader Nick Locarno claiming it was all the fault of their dead teammate. But after consulting his old mentor Boothby, Picard works out that they were trying to perform a dangerous and banned stunt. Picard tells Wesley what he knows and threatens to submit the evidence if he won't own up. But will Wesley do the right thing in the end?
Will he indeed? Alex, you had never seen this episode before. What did you make of it?
Well, I haven't, but I mean, in some respects, it feels like I have. I mean, this isn't particularly new ground, is it? I mean, it's fairly slight, I would say. It's as you say, it's a trial episode, but I mean, it is a trial episode, but it's also sort of a peer pressure episode. In some respects, it's not a massive world away from something you might see in, I don't know, Neighbours or something like that, with someone who's seen someone mowed down by a car or whatever kind of vehicular accidents they have in Australia and on Ramsay Street, and then
they have all kinds.
An incredible amount of accidents and lack of travel that takes place in that small corner of Australia.
I fundamentally disagree that this could be done in Neighbours.
I just mean in the sense of that type of story of person knows some information but is loyal to the person that it relates to and therefore is conflicted about bringing that information forward. It's a fairly common story trope, but it's specifically common to that sort of soap opera world, which, you know, when we've got a series with a lot of episodes like this, yeah, and in some respects, you know, the setup isn't a million miles away from a sort of soap opera setup in terms of a regular cast who don't really particularly leave their small confines. You know, it makes sense that you would hit upon those, but when you remove all of the element of it being a trial and remove the spacey parts, it is just that story trope, really. Which is not a problem. It's not a problem. It's just, you know, it's something that Star Trek does and has done and does well, but it's not something that immediately sort of elevates it to the top of the pile, even though there are obviously good moments within it with, you know, Picard's speeches, etc. And I have no idea, but I'm fairly certain that the ranking for this episode probably relies mostly on what Picard says rather than the events of the actual episode themselves.
I think it's a little bit unfair to boil it down to just tropes, really, because what I really liked about this episode is that it pushed a character into a moral situation that you wouldn't have normally seen them in, and any Star Trek character for that matter. I think in the early days of Next Generation, it was always that in the 24th century, people were more evolved and they didn't have these conflicts and they were beyond these ideas that we are now. And it's nice to have a storyline where Wesley is facing peer pressure, but also, is that the only element here? Is it too simplistic to just say Locarno is controlling the team? Because I think at times they all have to face their own responsibility.
I guess on that, Alex, were you happy to see Wesley return? We saw him
No.
earlier this season in the game where they were trying to make him more of a sort of leading man type, I guess, a romantic lead. And here he's very much back to being, in some ways, the teenager at college, having been caught doing something wrong. A different facet rather than seeing him just being the boy wonder on the bridge. He's definitely lost a lot of spark that he had in that earlier episode, though.
Yeah, it's the edges have really been blunted for good and ill, really, because it's far less irritating. But the flip side of that is that Wesley is a bit of a nothing character in this. He's conflicted, but what else? He's stoic.
It's a way into Starfleet Academy, and incidentally, we've never seen Starfleet Academy before. We've seen Starfleet headquarters. This is the first time we do this. And actually, like you say, in a soap opera sort of way, if you were doing a 90s Starfleet Academy show, this feels like a prototypical episode. Oh, we've done something wrong and we've covered it up and we're going to have to suffer the consequences, but we'll do the right thing in the end because that's what happened in those sort of teen shows, like Starfleet Academy Saved by the Bell type thing. But he does provide a way into this world for the crew of the Enterprise. It's an excuse to do something new, a little bit more textured, but he is not really the driving force of it in some ways. Because he represents our crew, of course the moral quandary is slightly lessened, I think, in the end, but it does also show how he reacts when put in a particular moral situation, as James said, and I think it's an interesting one, because I think the character of Nick Locarno is somewhat interesting. A villain, a good captain, the sort of person that would go far under other circumstances. It's just unfortunate. Robert Duncan McNeil obviously went on to be Tom Paris in Voyager, pretty much a version of this character, but I'd say there's differences. But the charismatic leader, do you buy that? He would be able to persuade all these people to do the wrong thing in this very sort of society where truth is so valued and humanity is supposedly so evolved.
I mean, I certainly accept it in the way that it's presented by the episode. There's nothing that makes me go, well, I'm not sure I buy that. You know, in terms of what's presented, yes, absolutely, I can accept that at face value. Would it have more impact were we dealing with more than just Wesley being a familiar character? Yes, I think it probably would. I think that some of the impact of the story is probably lost, that really the only thing that you know about him is what is relayed by other characters, and then the rest of the time just him sort of going, "Hey, come on, you got to stand up for your team." But that's kind of it. But as presented, there's nothing wrong with it. But you could have it be more impactful were it someone we know.
Do you think the rest of the characters in that team, I feel they could be given more nuance?
Well, most of the time they're just sort of looking down forlornly. Yes.
Yeah, and I wanted them to have sort of more of their motivations, more of their reasons for doing it. Starfleet had been an escape for them. They were really strongly motivated to lie, essentially. Obviously, they've done something wrong, but it does seem like if they had told the truth, that things are always better when you tell the truth, guys.
Well, except in this circumstance where they pretty much got away with it and then told the truth. But I think that there's multiple elements to this, and maybe I'm reading into it too much, but an element about Wesley's character in this episode, which it isn't really pushed by the script, but I do feel like it's there. He's lost a good friend. I mean, there's that scene where he's speaking with his father. I mean, maybe I'm just more sensitive to this at the moment because I've had a few bereavements recently, but, you know, I think that the part of the reason we're seeing a different Wesley is because he has just lost somebody in tragic circumstances, and he takes a lot of the blame himself.
Yeah, I mean, think of all of these people who have got into Starfleet Academy, they've all had to go into horrible recreations of deaths of a loved one before they get into the Academy. So they all come with a certain amount of baggage. And speaking of which, what do you think of the relationship here between Beverly and Wesley? Probably a good companion piece to Picard season 3 here, because she seems to be acting absolutely bizarrely. Just that their interactions show so little affection and love. She seems like she's like a zombie in some ways throughout. It seems like an odd performance choice.
Well, in a first scene, when Picard's telling her about what happened, she's just gone into kind of complete kind of motherly doctor overload and just trying to do what she can, even though she's light years away. And then in the next scene, I think it's the next scene with her and Wesley, she's just seeing things from the perspective of Wesley must be innocent, therefore there must be an answer that will reveal the truth, which I think is a fair enough approach, really. Because in an episode where we know there's a big cover-up and our character is in the right, that is how the rest of the Enterprise crew would act. It's only because we have the knowledge that this is the cover-up is that they did something wrong instead of somebody else did. So, Wesley is in the wrong. So what I mean is, if Wesley was in the right, I don't think what Dr. Crusher was saying would be as strange.
No, yeah, it's that sort of shocked response, putting a brave face on it. I mean, there's no problem with it. I just don't think it goes very deep on the issue, which, absolutely doesn't have to. I thought there were some interesting strands that you could pull at a little bit more, but obviously you're limited by the runtime unless you're going to make this into a multi-parter, and I don't know that would really benefit it, to be perfectly honest. But certainly, the wider implications that are suggested about the influence that Nova Squad has at Starfleet Command are interesting as to what the fallout would be from the revelation. I think there's also an interesting thread about they're pretty certain that they know what the verdict is. They know that they're guilty, but that they can't find that one piece of evidence to just push it across the line. It's there, but it's not driving anything particularly. It's referenced, it comes up in the next scene, but then by that point Wesley is saying we did it, so then it sort of goes away. Yeah, just a few things that you could pull off in different directions, but it's very much sort of looking at it as this is the story, and we'll stick in the lane from start to finish.
Do you think that just because this episode did make me think of the recent film Anatomy of a Fall, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but would this episode have worked if Wesley hadn't actually done anything wrong? Maybe they were just protecting a friend who made a mistake.
I have no reason it couldn't. It would just be a different story. There is entirely possibly the point here that I'm in the mindset of the interest of the sort of court case element and the jury verdicts, just purely also in terms of things that I've watched recently over here in the UK. There's been that program on Channel 4 not that long ago of showing a fake case to two separate juries who think it's a real case, and seeing how the peer pressure within a jury affects the outcome of a case. So perhaps that's on me. Perhaps it's just I'm more interested in the story that it's not telling just purely from where my mind is at right now.
I guess as a legal procedural, is it gripping enough? And I'm not sure that it is, because obviously we know something is up very early in the episode. mainly through Wesley not talking. We've seen with Locarno saying, oh, we've all got to stick together, just stick to our story. Well, I'm not sure I can do that. Again, we're ahead of our heroes in some way, because if these guys are the villains of the piece, we're given that piece of the puzzle. Obviously, we're not told what exactly it was they were doing, and that reveal is fairly slow, but it doesn't feel massively satisfying, the investigation, I don't think, because we obviously send our favourite double act, Geordi and Data, oh, can you do an investigation? Sure. And then it's like, well, they did this was a bit weird, this was odd, and then, oh, they left the fuel pipe open, and then Picard goes, I know exactly what they were doing. And to me, that sort of feels a little bit unsatisfactory as the kind of uncovering of evidence goes. It's nice to have the little kind of, we've got satellite footage, we know you weren't in the right formation, but I feel like I wanted more of a detective element to it. I think more of a Law and Order to get to the bottom of it, rather than a sudden realisation.
I think part of that is also the fact that you couldn't have really guessed what they were doing. I mean, you could take a sort of rough guess that they were doing a manoeuvre, I suppose, but there's no Chekhov's gun set up early to sort of at the end go, of course. But then I also think that the procedural element of it is, although in some respects it's presented as quite a dominant part of the episode, I really don't actually think it is. I think it is purely the moral dilemma, which is interesting, really, because the idea of duty over loyalty, you would assume would pervade more of the episode, really, but it really only kicks in with that confrontation between Picard and Wesley.
I think that all the elements are there, but what they could have done was not have the conversations between Locarno and Wesley and the rest of Nova Squadron. So when Geordi, Data and Picard have that realisation, that is when the audience finds out that they were doing something dangerous, that they are hiding something. And I think that's more what kind of season 3, 4 and 5 of TNG is about, whereas the way it's portrayed here is kind of back to the storytelling style of season 1. Even though I think it's harsh to portray Locarno as a villain.
Well, at this stage, does he not come back in later series as very much a villain? Not of this show.
He is the recurring bad guy in Star Trek Lower Decks season 4.
Right, so, okay, that's how I didn't know that.
Hey, he looks just like Tom Paris. I don't see it.
My understanding is that this episode actually sort of becomes quite relevant to recent Star Trek in various, because doesn't this also have implications for Prodigy as well? Yes,
indeed. The just released season 2 of Star Trek Prodigy, as we record this, features a new Nova Squadron and indeed Wesley Crusher. So you go seek that out if you want to.
Of all of the episodes to become quite important to recent Star Trek, if you'd asked me what one's from this season, I absolutely wouldn't have picked this episode out. But, fair enough. I mean, there's certainly stuff to expand upon, but it's just a surprising one to run with.
Well, it's even more important in the sense that one of Locarno was supposed to be in Voyager, but because they couldn't agree on the rights to the character without having to pay a license fee every episode, they made a new character. And this episode does kind of have a sequel in TNG, which is called Lower Decks, which inspires the spin-off.
Yeah, and indeed Lower Decks has basically a flashback scene to this episode in it, which kind of explains character motivations within that show, which is nice. And like, this show kind of spins off as well into different elements. Like you will have the return of Boothby and Voyager.
Everyone was crying out for that return.
This is one of these sort of Star Trek Nexus episodes where there are many elements of it that that spin off in different directions. So let's, I guess, talk about Picard's old Academy mentor, Boothby, the gardener who's been there forever, kind of a stock character type, I suppose. Oh, he's not the professor, but he's the wisest man. First mentioned in Final Mission, of course, that Picard told Wesley to seek him out, which is a nice touch that they remembered that. What do you think? Do you think that relationship adds enough to the episode?
I think it's certainly necessary, because that idea of sort of pushing Picard into the position where he will give the speech that is necessary to make Wesley make the right decision. That, essentially Picard has been there before, although it's not really elaborated as to what happened. There are allusions. And I think that's interesting, especially with playing that with Picard, the most straight-laced, and saying, oh, but the reckless days, that sort of element. It's probably the most interesting character you could do that with.
And it's strange, really, because that was a late addition to the script, the idea of Picard having this problem in the Academy that Boothby helped him with. When you look at the episode as a whole, it does feel like it's trying to demonstrate that even with this setback, Wesley and the rest of Nova Squadron, can still go on to become successful. Something bad happening when you're a child, it doesn't necessarily have to wreck your future.
No, it's the showing that the colour of your character will be the most important thing in the long run, which feels very Star Trek. Is it ever elaborated on as to what Picard actually did?
I mean, I wondered if it was related to him getting stabbed, but I don't think that was it.
I don't think it is. It's never elaborated on. I guess it doesn't need to be. It does enough of the job. I do quite like that as the theme, that young people make terrible decisions, and everyone will, but it's just whether there are consequences or whether you can deal with the consequences, or how you come out of that the other side. I quite like that as this idea.
Very soap opera.
That's universal.
Yeah, well, that's the point. Nothing wrong with that. It is, as you say, a universal story point. It's just dressing it up in the trappings of sci-fi.
And is that a problem? Because
no,
but like you could, if there was a Top Gun TV show or something like that, you could do that. This almost exact script there. You do not need the science fiction element of it. They're flying in space. That's pretty much it. They're doing a maneuver with a fancy name, but this pretty much doesn't need to be a science fiction episode of television. So there is no alternative science fiction plot, really. It is very much about the flight team did something crazy, someone got killed, consequences.
No, and I mean, absolutely, there isn't a need. I just think it's interesting sometimes to look under the hood, get past the facade and say, oh, okay, that's what's happening here. This area is what we're exploring, as you might do with another show. I mean, it's certainly not exclusive to Star Trek, taking that approach. I just think it's interesting when you analyse it in the wider context of the show and sort of, consider bizarrely the similarities that there are between TNG and soap operas at times. But then I suppose that's true of any series that's going to have as many episodes as so many US programs do at this point.
Which unfortunately they don't anymore.
I mean, controversially, I'm fine with that.
I think it's a bad thing that television like this isn't made anymore. Not specific to TNG, but that you don't have shows doing episodes like this.
No, I completely agree. And I think this is very different to any other episode in this series of TNG. It brings in new characters, it has a different location. Obviously, there's a mystery procedural, there's a courtroom element to it, which is very familiar to Star Trek. But I agree. I miss what people call filler shows, which are not filler shows. They are self-contained stories, and that's all they are. And that is what I want from television. And now people will tell me Star Trek Strange New Worlds does that, and it does it well, and it kind of has the character plot arcs running throughout and things in the background. But I would say, especially in season 2, that show felt a need to up its game every single time. It's like, we've got to do the different thing, we've got to do the bigger and bigger, because they're doing self-contained stories, which people will probably call mini movies. I don't need mini movies, I want an episode of a television show. And if that show was 13, 15 episodes rather than the 10 that we get, I think we would probably get a bit more space to do that. It doesn't have to be ambitious, it just has to be well written and entertaining. And I think for the most part, this is. To me, I think Wesley's kind of the weak link in the story. Like, Picard gives an impassioned speech at the end. The first duty is to the truth. And great, it's one of those quotes that gets put on t-shirts. It doesn't feel like Wesley is ever making that decision for himself. Obviously, because Picard gives him that ultimatum, which is, you do it or I'll do it. And I know the writers certainly had a debate about it. One thought he would never turn on his friends. That was Ron Moore, but Naren Shankar thought, well, he would, because he is one of our heroes and he will tell the truth. But you don't get the sense he's telling the truth out of any kind of real moral obligation. Obviously, he needs to be pushed into that, but he's torn to an extent. But I would have liked him to have arrived at that conclusion before he was pushed into it, I suppose.
I think they do it the best way they can, because really your only option is what they did do, which is he had gotten away with it, because it didn't even seem like Picard was actually going to reveal the truth. All that would happen is he would lose Picard's respect. But the other option is that it's one of the other people who reveal the truth, because there's no other time when Wesley could have revealed the truth. There needed to be something to spare it on, and the only way to kind of give him some level of autonomy to it is that he did it after he'd already gotten away with it.
Had the verdict come in that they were all getting thrown out and they had lost everything anyway, and then he'd revealed it, that probably would have been not as satisfying an ending. But then I guess we have the opposite, the one who did lie, in Nick Locarno, and he fights to save the rest of his team. A noble sacrifice, I guess. Like I say, it is a complicated character, but ultimately, the guy who lies when someone died, Nick's a bad guy, right?
It's overly simplifying it to describe him as the villain. I know obviously he's using the death of a friend to save their own necks, but at the same time, he is just protecting both himself and his friends. He knows he made a mistake. I think he's well aware of that, and in the end, he does own up to it, albeit after the truth was already revealed. And I do think that there is an element to it where, certainly from Wesley's perspective, it doesn't seem like it is Locarno pushing him at every avenue. There is an element that Wesley did want to go along with this.
The father, Lieutenant Commander Albert, obviously a Starfleet father, some emotional scenes in the episode with him. He basically confesses to Wesley, says, my son screwed up, it's his fault and I'm sorry. I mean, you got to feel that Wesley should have reacted differently to that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that scene. I think it was scripted and played wonderfully. It's something that I don't think Star Trek has ever kind of gone into that area, the grief that he was feeling. And we don't see, well, anything of him following the revelation of Nova Squadron, do we?
No. And maybe that would have been a sort of denouement, just him slapping Wesley or something like that. It just feels... just the actual thought of it is horrendous. As a character, as a human, what that must be like to go through that level of grief and then people are lying to your face about it. That's deeply unpleasant. However, he gives Wesley's jumper back, and it's great to see he's still got a hideous taste in jumpers.
If anything, that kid deserved to die for wearing that jumper.
Yeah, I lent him that one and I didn't want it back.
I think I would have liked to have heard Wesley a little bit more not conflicted, but sort of making the argument of why he shouldn't act. Because we don't really get him elaborating on it too much. But going back to what you were saying, I think circling back to kind of where we were at the start of this, I think part of the issue there is we don't know these characters until this episode. We have limited time to become familiar with them, and therefore we don't have that huge amount of background to be able to sort of get a deep impression of what Locarno's character is, in terms of how much of his action is out of self-interest, how much of it is out of acting for the team. I mean, that's also partly not helped by the fact that his throwing himself in front of the bullet for the rest of the team is done off camera. You don't see it. You're just told about it afterwards, and it possibly would have been more interesting to see that happen rather than just have the events relayed. But also, I think another element where you're taken out of it a little bit more than you might have been otherwise is the fact that because Wesley has been absent for a fair while now, it's not a sort of reintroduction to Wesley, because clearly it's not, but it doesn't feel quite the same entry in as it would be with someone we'd been watching the prior week, put it that way. There's a bit more of a distance.
The other two characters, the other two members of Nova Squadron, they are pretty much blank slates. They don't give them enough material. And I think there was room for it. There was room for them to have different personalities rather than, as I said before, just looking down for most of the episode.
I think that's it. Overall, perfectly solid episode. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. There's just also some elements where it would be interesting to see it expanded on a little bit more. And I don't know that there's any one particular answer to it. I think it's the result of various factors. But in some respects, that's one of the interesting things about it, is how those factors result in the episode that we get.
Pretty much all we've got to say on that, but we're going to say a few more things in the space we call Quickfire.
Quickfire.
Producers wanted Ashley Judd, who you may remember played Ensign Robin Leffler in the game. They wanted her back for this episode, but that didn't work out. And actually, I think that might be quite nice to have someone for Wesley to confide in, to play out the emotions that wasn't either Nova Squadron or Picard. That might have been useful in this episode. I suppose they could have given him a different girlfriend who was on Nova Squadron. But yeah, that might have been nice, but we'll never see her again.
Well, let's turn to the lethargic laments of the Nitpicker's Guide. Not a huge amount of overtly controversial stuff this time, which is a blessed relief considering some of the recent entries that we've had. I do just want to... I'm not going to go into the depths of actually reading it because it's deathly dull. But Phil Farrand does spend quite a bit of time questioning why Picard is upset over the omissions in Wesley's testimony, saying that isn't this the same Picard who flings aside his oath to the Prime Directive all the time? Does he, though? I don't know that he does. I mean, you tell me, but my opinion on it has been that in prior episodes he's been the real person to overcome on that issue. Unless I'm forgetting something.
I'm sure it's referencing something specific, but it's not really his character overall, is it?
Not really. It's an odd criticism, but I mean, I suppose it's something you go to when your comments on equipment oddities is that the dormitory doors at Starfleet Academy have regular door handles and hinges.
To be honest, I did notice that. I did think, why isn't there any proper doors in Starfleet Academy?
And yet, the doors give a little erp sound. If the doors are human-powered, doesn't it seem like a waste of energy to have them erping every time they're opened?
Look, there's nothing wrong with doors. Like we have automatic doors now, right? But I don't go, oh God, I wish my front door was like a supermarket. It's really inconvenient to push it ever so slightly. Like, it's okay. Things change. Technology changes, but that doesn't mean we don't still keep some of the old stuff around.
Does he actually describe them as human-powered?
He does. I mean, it's a real chapter for that. I mean, he also complains that you can see Picard's breath in some of the outdoor shots, but then not in others.
He's inhaling at that point.
I mean, he sort of goes into a bit of the Partridge with it by saying that evidently time has elapsed between shooting Picard's footage and shooting the groundskeeper's footage. Either that or the groundkeeper is part lizard. Open brackets, i.e. he's cold-blooded. Thanks for the clarification, Phil.
He actually is kind of like a lizard thing in a Voyager episode.
Foreshadowing.
On that note, this is the first time we see Boothby. He will be back in Voyager episodes in the flesh and the fight. Neither time as himself. A really weird kind of idea, but nice to see Ray Walston, most famous for My Favourite Martian, which I don't think we got much of over here. I might be wrong.
Nope, never seen My Favourite Martian.
No, I haven't.
Sad. Shannon Phil will be back in the season 7 episode of Star Trek Next Generation, Lower Decks, and will then reprise her part and basically this time period in Lower Decks episode Old Friends, New Planets, which is nice. She pretty much retired from acting, but they got her back for a couple of lines.
You may be wondering if Memory Beta has any information about what happened to characters in the expanded universe of Star Trek in novels. Well, in an alternative reality, Locarno gets turned into a Borg.
Of course, right, yeah.
Robert Duncan McNeil, as we've mentioned, a regular on Voyager, now a very successful television director. He returned to his original role of Nick Locarno in the final 2 episodes of Lower Decks Season 4, The Inner Fight and Old Friends, New Planets. And it's very entertaining. If you've not watched it, I highly recommend it.
I had no idea that he returns in Lower Decks.
he also plays Tom Paris in Lower Decks. So
do they both appear on screen together?
No, he's in a different episode, which is called We'll Always Have Tom Paris, which is excellent. Just the title. The episode's fine. Just some behind the scenes chat. Jerry Taylor, co-executive producer, said she felt this episode humanised Wesley in a way that he never has been, and maybe now would allow fans to actually like him. He wore this awful mantle of the genius child who always saved the ship, and in that sense seemed remote from a real person. He was the perfect Wesley, and that was hard for people to identify with. He made a mistake, a bad mistake. He's flawed. Yeah, but I just don't think he gets enough nuance in this episode. Ron Moore said similar. We took the character in a really interesting direction, and I think it helps him grow as a character a lot and makes him more accessible and human. I'm really happy with what the episode became. So, sure.
Ish.
Wesley has a model of the original Enterprise in his quarters, taking after Picard.
Is it the Eagle Moss?
No, it's the Franklin Mint, issued in the late 1980s. They probably had a big factory full of them that never sold.
Well, that is us done with another episode. We hope you'll come back again next time when we will be talking about the cost of living. It's grim, isn't it? But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. I'm just occasionally thankful that it's Memory Alpha that we're turning to and not TARDIS Wiki, where you have entries like Sooty was assassinated.
Hang on, I'm just checking if TARDIS Wiki still has an entry for penis. Penis was... Wait, why is it in the past tense? A penis was a reproductive organ. It was also known colloquially as a knob or cock. But behind the scenes...
R.I.P. the penis.